But we'll just proceed and see what happens. Favorite author of mine is the late Kurt Vonnegut, who had insights deep into the human psyche. In his writings, he was able to unclothe the body of human foibles, laying bare for all to see. From him, this quote: "There is a tragic flaw in our precious Constitution, and I don't know what can be done to fix it. This is it. Only nutcases want to be president." He uses a slanderous colloquialism, nutcases, which is somewhat ambiguous. What do you suppose he meant by that? Anybody have a
You have to be a little
thought?
crazy to want to be president.
Huh?
You have to be a little crazy to want to be president.
Well, crazy in what way?
Need for power, just horrendous need for power.
And willing,
I
to,
think
Overwhelming.
I think you've got something there. Okay.
and willing to put yourself in that position of ridicule and being, I mean, you're in front of the world. you
Being
know.
attacked, being
That's-
vulnerable to being attacked.
Or idolized.
Yes. George Orwell, in his novel 1984, has one of the ruling protagonists, O'Brien, say, "Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution, the object of torture is torture, the object of power is power." Of late, having been forced to mostly succumb to age-related physical limitations, I am tending to seek the mental pleasures that suit me. Part of this revolves around the computer, which I find to be quite limitless in its variety of subjects, and also partly occurs in the middle of those frequent sleepless periods at night, while I lie awake trying to put together bits and pieces of old and new knowledge into some semblance of figuring out how things work. So what is my motivation for doing this? Surely I have no power to change the onward rush of sobering history. I think much of my motivation comes from a natural interest in such. Also, it is one antidote to depression if one can foresee in some new knowledge there might be a chance in the future of enhancing the chances for human and the planet's survival. My interest is mostly two-pronged. In one, I gravitate toward my old profession of helping people change their behavior to make their lives less problematic. One can apply some of these same principles of systems theory to smooth out difficulties both in families and in international relations. It's a shame it doesn't happen. But we will not pursue this prong of interest at this time, perhaps for another talk in the future. The other prong stems from the following realization. Were it not for man's inhumanity to man and the concomitant stupidity of man, existence on this planet could be almost an Eden. So then what is the main problem? We can go through a whole litany of things that have a negative impact, starting with the study of evil. Is the human species so evil that there is no escape from the consequences of its existence on Earth? Today, let's take a look at possible sources underlying some of the activities ascribed to man, which might well qualify as evil. Not hard to find reported activities in the news to become aware of human activities that would be evil. Take war, for example. perhaps the ultimate evil. Another would be environmental destruction for some personal gain, mass murders, rape, and torture. So then where does this evil come from? Having a conscience and being empathic are normal qualities which appear more or less in persons who have reached a certain level of maturity. So it is not likely that the primary source for evil, would be among members of the general population. So then one needs to ask if there are people without conscience or empathy, and what role do they play in human activity? Turning to psychology, we find there's clearly defined disorders such as psychopathy and narcissism, which we will consider shortly. Psychopaths are characterized with some traits as follows: fearless dominance, closeness and superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, lying pathologically, cunning and manipulative, lack of remorse or guilt, emotionally shallow, lack of empathy and callousness, failure to accept responsibility for one's own actions, impulsive antisociality. From my perspective, it appears that many of the leaders of the world, past or present, or persons with much political power, have these traits in abundance. Hence the title of my talk, What's With Our Leaders? Can anyone think of some important leaders, past or present, who might be imbued with some of these traits?
I think Trump has all of them.
All of them? Well, maybe so. To a more or less degree.
And of course,
In other words, I'm talking about important leaders, not mayors and people like that, you know.
Stalin.
Putin.
Who?
Putin, Russian leader.
Putin, well,
Putin, sorry.
I think some of our people here too qualify pretty well, that we've put in charge here.
detractors accused,
Huh?
the detractors accused Hillary of having all of those qualities, but, I mean.
Maybe so. Robert Hare, a Canadian psychologist who has made his life work a study of psychopathy and psychopaths, has defined the traits which are characteristic of those so afflicted with that aberration. He's created a scale to measure psychopathy. I'm going to skip a little bit here just for time purposes. One might assume that psychopaths would gravitate toward a life of crime. Many do. Hare estimates about a quarter of those incarcerated are psychopaths. Since the constellation of traits will vary, some may be inclined toward overt crime, while others are able to skirt the law. And then in our two-tiered justice system, if one achieves enough power, one can often flaunt the law with impunity. Those who possess such traits will be on a bell curve kind of continuum, so that many who do not qualify, according to Hare's definition of psychopaths, having on his scale there a score of 30 or above, will still have a psychopathic lean. Let's see. I hope I don't. I'm going to have to make some
Bill, just take as
It's
much
a
time,
little,
take as much time as you need, that's
Well-
really fine. We've got,
we're
fine.
Well, all right. All right. I mean, I'm willing. We want to leave some time maybe for discussion too. According to psychologist Craig S. Newman, Robert Hare and I conducted a study of over 500 individuals living in a major metropolitan area of the U.S. We found that 2/3 of this large community sample had a score of 2 or less on one of his checklists. However, approximately 1 to 2% of individuals were rated in the elevated level of psychopathic propensities. That means 1 to 2 people out of every 100 manifest elevated psychopathic traits. In this same study, we found the psychopathy dimensions predicted increases in violent, aggressive behavior, alcohol use, consistent with research on offenders. Similarly, we have examined large samples of individuals within various corporate or business settings. In one study, we found nearly 4% of high-profile corporate leaders had scores that qualified them as psychopathic. That's 2 to 4 times the rate of elevated psychopathic propensities found in the general community. So, people high up on the corporate scale tended to be more that way, more psychopathic than just the regular people. In this study, a related corporate psychopathy study, we found that the individuals with psychopathic propensities wreaked havoc on the lives of their fellow employees. I don't know if any of you worked for a boss that might qualify as such or not, but a lot of people have. While we're considering other attributes, let's some of our leaders might share. Let's take a look at narcissists. According to the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, they list the following criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. Has a grandiose sense of self-importance, preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love, believes that he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high status people or institutions. Requires excessive admiration. Is highly susceptible to flattery, has a sense of entitlement, is interpersonally exploitive, lacks empathy, is willing or unable to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others, is often envious of others and believes that others are envious of him or her, shows arrogant, haughty, rude, and abusive behaviors and attitudes. Anybody think of anybody?
Can anybody not think of anybody?
You're all on one-track mind here, I'm afraid.
Well, Bernie Madoff.
Huh?
Bernie Madoff.
Oh, Madoff. Oh, yeah.
Who took a.
He would be, either, maybe,
No, I'm not a psychologist.
Well-
but-
we can guess about these people. He certainly is a psychopath, I would think.
Mhm.
Concerning whether or not narcissists are born or made, there may be some controversy. Unlike psychopaths, thought to be hardwired at birth to be psychopaths, The general consensus is that narcissists are born with a strong predisposition for narcissism, but such is amenable to change under some circumstances. But then, since the human critter is undeniably complex, there appear to be situations involving wealth where persons can move in and out of being narcissistic. We will consider the work of Paul Piff and colleagues later in this discourse. However, basically here you can see that there are some characteristics that narcissists and psychopaths have in common, most notably being personally exploitive and lacking empathy. Somewhat recently, the term malignant narcissist has been bandied about, being in essence a combination of narcissism and psychopathy. Added to this personality type is another nasty attribute, that of sadism, or the pleasure in inflicting pain on others. If one can see that if you imbue such persons with great power, a lot of mayhem can come about in the arena in which they operate. So we will look today at potential sources of power to run amok. In this discussion, it is important to bring up Niccolo Machiavelli. People heard of everyone knows about Machiavelli, more or less. He's a famous person, lived in the 15th century. Florence, Italy, a public servant, a person close to power, but he didn't have power himself. He was in a position to advise some who do. He was also a close observer of what a successful ruler needed to do to get and maintain power. He wrote a book called The Prince, a book whose influence has reverberated through the ages among leaders and political philosophers. Basically, it is a manual for potential and actual leaders for getting and retaining power. To reduce the Machiavellian concept to their most basic would be to say that the ends justify the means, although it should be noted that this quote has been disputed and may not come from Machiavelli in his writings. The expanded concepts are that violence may be necessary for the successful consolidation of power and the introduction of new legal institutions. Force may be used to eliminate political rivals, to coerce resistant populations, and to purge the community of other men strong enough of a character to rule, who will inevitably attempt to replace the ruler. A few quotes from Machiavelli. Politics has no relation to morals. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. One who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. A prince never lacks legitimate reasons to break his promises. Scholars have argued that Machiavelli was a major indirect and direct influence upon the political thinking of the founding fathers of the United States. Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson followed Machiavelli's republicanism when they opposed what they saw as the emerging aristocracy that they feared Alexander Hamilton was creating with the Federalist Party. However, the founding father who perhaps most studied and valued Machiavelli as a political philosopher was John Adams, who profusely commented on the Italians' thought for his work, A Defense of the Constitution of Government of the United States of America. So, we got Machiavelli threads through the American history. Do you think he's influential today in politics and among leaders?
Yes,
If you were going to become, if it was very important for you to become a very important leader, do you think you'd maybe take his advice, Machiavelli? I mean, you know, you'd have to.
Not me, but certainly
Well, I mean, you'd
those
have
who
to.
want to become,
who
who want to become leaders, yes.
Yeah, in other words, power, the urge for power overrules everything else. More or less.
Yes.
Right.
Okay,
And I think that's what we're witnessing.
right. In more recent times, psychologists have taken from the print certain advisements listing them as personality traits, thereby in the process coining the term Machiavellian to describe a kind of personality. This concept of Machiavellianism as a personality variable was first described by Christie and Guise in 1970 for describing people with a Machiavellian disposition. They even designed a personality test to measure persons on this dimension, which can be found online. If you want to test yourself, you can go online and take the Machiavellian test.
I think
Find out if you're a
I
Machiavellian.
didn't realize it came out in the seventies. I thought it came before that.
Huh?
I thought the Machiavellian traits study had come out prior to the seventies. I didn't
Well,
realize it was
they-
the seventies.
They pulled it, perhaps so. They pulled the, but in more recent times, I think they've sort of incorporated this into psychological thinking.
Yes.
I think I would point out that, I mean, I believe to most of us here in this room, the Machiavellian traits would be viewed as a negative thing. But people don't necessarily consider being Machiavellian negative. Some people might consider that to be a positive thing, you know? You might try to use that word as an insult to someone and they say, well, of course I'm Machiavellian. How else am I going to be a powerful person? And it's much like the way people try to use a liberal as an insult, you know?
And I don't even see it.
If you're just a liberal, you know, well,
Thank you.
So maybe if you want to be an effective leader,
I don't know.
maybe if you want to be an effective leader, you have to be pretty much Machiavellian.
I don't know. It's a good
If
question.
you look at leaders, it seems to me that
Right.
most of them
Well,
qualified pretty well.
Yeah, I have people throw socialism at me. I go, well, quit using the roads. Send your Social Security and Medicaid back, because that is socialism.
We
And they
have,
don't say anything in return.
well, we have a lot of socialist
Because
elements
they don't
in
know that.
society.
Don't you think
You're just a
ruthlessness is a
socialist.
requirement?
Uh,
Don't you think ruthlessness is a requirement?
Don't you think
Ruthlessness.
ruthlessness is a requirement?
Oh, yes,
But see, Bernie
sounds
almost,
like it.
Bernie almost made it, and he's not these things.
I wonder, how about Jimmy Carter? I think
And
if
Obama.
there was one who displayed a small amount of those traits, I think he might be an example. He was a beautiful man
But
and
not,
continues to
But
be.
they, but they wouldn't
historically
re-elect
not
him.
be.
because
And he was a
a
one-term
successful
president.
At one turn, exactly.
Because they
Because
didn't
of the
view him as
small
tough
amount
enough.
that you just described.
That's it.
He didn't have a lot of those characteristics.
Right.
Anyway,
That is a dilemma.
the psychologists have taken from the prints certain advisements and listed them as personality traits, thereby in the process coining the term Machiavellian. Oh, I'm sorry, I went through this already. It was explained that people high in Machiavellianism tended to have three key characteristics, which have been inferred from Machiavellian's writing. First, they adopt a cynical view of the world and other people, expecting that each person is invested solely in his or her own self-interest. Well, what's capitalism?
Self-interest.
I mean, second, they are willing to utilize manipulative tactics to influence others and secure desired outcomes. Third, they are quite willing to depart from ethical standards when ethical behavior provides a necessary advantage over others, unethical behavior. To this end, Machiavellianism entails a freedom from ethical consideration rather than a propensity to always behave unethically. Adding to this concept of Machiavellianism has pointed out that Machiavellian people behave this way predominantly out of a motivation to secure extrinsic achievements, rewards, status, and power over others. Now, Machiavelli, the man, needs to be separated from the concept of Machiavellian. According to political science, Maurizio Veroli, Machiavellian was definitely not Machiavellian in his personal life. Paradoxically, he spoke truth when he advised leaders to lie under circumstances, having observed that the willingness to lie was a quality successful leaders had. Okay, now we're talking about three personality types, all quite capable of committing evil deeds. The psychopath, the narcissist, and the Machiavellian person.
Come right back.
These three personality types, each in isolation, can be bad enough, but in combination they're often utterly toxic. The term used to describe the combination of these three dark personality types have been referred to as the dark triad. There is also a test online. You can measure yourself on the dark triad if you want. All kinds of stuff online. In summary, the psychopath is aggressive, callous, and lacks remorse and empathy. They get their way through superficial, charming manner. Ooh. How many people have been lured into voting for a charming candidate for president? We've had a few.
How many people have been lured into a relationship with a charming
Yes.
personality?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, this is kind of an aside here, but they say that women are very often attracted to psychopaths because they get lured in, and then it's nothing but trouble for them.
I just, earlier I was thinking about Manson.
Huh?
I was thinking about Charles Manson.
Well, oh yeah, Manson.
Yeah.
Yep, yeah. Well, he was he manifested a lot of manipulative power for sure.
How about some of these preachers out there?
All right.
Don't even.
Uh-huh.
Have all these crazy, have
And
all
other
these followers.
Yeah, and politicians, like you said, not just priests.
And it might even,
Charismatic people.
Yeah.
it might even be worthwhile to think about what actually constitutes the charming, what defines being charming itself. Obviously, it's one characteristic, one characteristic of that is being false about what you're doing, but not in the way that people see. You're deceptive, but in what way? And one of those ways is that the charming person pretends to care about people. They put forth the false front of caring about whoever it is they're trying to charm.
Absolutely lying.
Oftentimes, Cindy, oftentimes, you're absolutely right. Oftentimes the psychopath who eventually gets in trouble with the law doesn't rise to the top. But oftentimes the charming one is the one who can say to someone, apparently empathetically, "Oh my gosh, that happened to you? Oh, that's so sad." And that still can be surface kind of stuff. And it's the kind of thing that to a woman, it's, they send flowers right away. And once in the door, for a couple of weeks, oh boy.
You think it's the best thing ever?
Then the shift begins to occur.
And there's another really big indicator of someone who is charming, and that is that the person, whether it's to an individual or whether it's to a group, they have the tendency to make this effort of having their target feel separate from everyone else. It's like you and I have this in common. You and I have these particular things that we're interested
So
in.
we're special aside from
We're
everybody else.
special. We're different.
Yeah.
And they separate their audience or their target from everyone else, basically dehumanizing everyone else. And it's a very effective technique of controlling people.
Well,
Not that I know
leaders
much
can't
about
do a
this.
whole lot of harm without followers, can they?
No. Love fall.
And we have to talk about followers. Well, we've been talking about followers, people that get charmed, this is
Well,
sort
it
of
seems
the
sometimes
same
like,
idea.
like Paul Ryan, he's come right out and said it's his dream to cut Social Security and Medicare, but he still has people that just keep voting for him who depend on these programs. I don't get it.
Well, look how close Moore came to winning the election.
How can they
in
say
Alabama.
that he's a man of God when he hasn't displayed anything that I would think that their God would be for?
J.K. Rowling wrote a comment about that. He said, he does, right, he doesn't know that God is a black woman.
Yeah, take a hard look at the God you're assuming. Take a hard look at it.
In this day of instant communication, propaganda becomes the main source of influencing citizens to get them to follow.
With this net
Who was I?
neutrality.
I already mentioned that word propaganda to somebody. Was it you, Randy?
Maybe.
Yeah, well, here we are.
And well, that's what we're getting from our congressmen too, that represent us in Congress.
Propaganda.
Think about their stance on this tax bill
Right,
and the people that are
propaganda.
going to be hurt. And I don't know about you, but I have received postcards or huge display cards that tell about all the great things this tax bill is going to do. And what it's really going to do is hurt an awful lot of people.
Oh,
What tax bill?
Let's not talk
but it has a lot, they put out a lot of propaganda about it.
And how net neutrality is gonna
Right,
favor the message that they want to get out there.
right.
When they cheated on that, some guy, I saw a comment, he says, "I'd like to know how my mother, who's been dead for a year, commented in favor of net neutrality being abolished."
Okay.
That's creepy.
Yeah,
Women,
they had lots of phony comments up there.
a lot of women smoke. And a lot of them probably smoke based on somebody they may have never heard of. Does anyone have a clue who Does anyone here have a clue who that might be? The reason for your habit for smoking might be laid at the doorstep of one Edward Bernays. Anyone heard of Edward Bernays? He is tremendously influential, and yet people don't know of his name. The father of public relations. He published his seminal work Propaganda back in 1928. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Well, I mean, is there a conflict there? I mean, if you're manipulating people in a democracy, is that democracy?
It's deception.
I don't know. What do you think? Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Well, maybe that's the way it works. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, and our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. It is they who pull the wires that control the public mind.
Well, we could go down
The gimmick is to get followers through hook or by crook, more or less. Actually, Bernays was actually a nephew of Sigmund Freud. He made his big splash helping the Wilson administration promote the idea that U.S. efforts in World War I were intended to bring democracy to Europe. So we got, maybe one reason we got into World War I, which of course was a terribly stupid war for everybody, but having seen how effective propaganda might be during the war, Bernays wondered whether it might prove equally useful during peacetime. Propaganda had acquired a somewhat pejorative connotation, which would be further magnified during World War II, so Bernays promoted the term public relations, kind of a euphemism there. Let's see. Yes. His publicity campaigns were the stuff of legend. To overcome sales resistance to cigarette smokers among women, Bernays staged a demonstration at the 1929 Easter Parade, having fashionable young women flaunt their torches of freedom. It was taboo for women, I guess, for a long time, but Bernays gave them liberation to smoke.
Right. Well, this is also on piggybacks onto Virginia Slims, which was a cigarette that was aimed towards women.
Right, yes. I think that was after Bernays, but it was in the same vein, yes.
It's in the same vein.
Yeah.
It was after Bernays, absolutely.
He promoted Lucky Strikes. I don't know, you have to be kind of old to remember Lucky Strike Green.
Lucky Strike.
Yeah, you remember
I
it.
remember it.
The two of us, right?
Lucky Strike Green.
Lucky Strike Green has gone to war.
Lucky Strike Green, yep. Lucky Strike was green until World War II started.
It was a green package with a red bullseye on it.
Right.
But Lucky Strike Green went to
And
war.
it said, well, he promoted it. He promoted it with it. He said that the green forest hue of the pack was among the most fashionable of colors. Okay. He also promoted cigarettes as both soothing to the throat and slimming to the waistline. I don't know about soothing to the throat, I guess it slims the waistline maybe.
That's because you smoke instead of eat.
Kills your sense of smell.
Well, once you get cancer, you lose a lot of weight, yeah.
But get this, at home,
It does
Bernays-
suppress appetite too.
huh?
Smoking
Yeah, my sister
suppresses
took up
appetite to some
smoking.
degree.
Right,
Yes.
so you slim down, yeah. People give up smoking, they get fat.
Yeah.
Right. But
Well,
at
they-
home, Bernays was attempted to persuade his wife to kick the habit. Now that's, he didn't want his wife smoking, but it was all right for all these, well, of course he was getting paid on this other deal. When he would find a pack of her parliaments in their home, he would snap every one of them in half and throw them in the toilet. This is his wife. So, while promoting cigarettes as soothing and slimming, Bernays, it seems, was aware of some of the early studies linking smoking to cancer. Even though Bernays saw the power of propaganda during war and used it to sell products during peacetime, he couldn't have imagined that his writings on public relations would become a tool of the Third Reich. Now here he is, a guy with a Jewish background, and Joseph Goebbels picked up his book just like that and made big use of it. Joseph Goebbels became a avid admirer of Bernays and his writings. He created a Führer cult using Bernays around Adolf Hitler. Bernays learned that the Nazis were using his work in 1933, and he later recounted they were using my books as the basis of a destructive campaign against the Jews of Germany. This shocked me, but I knew any human activity can be used for social purposes or misused for anti-social ones. So he was sort of, to me, he didn't seem to be really sincere there. In other words, he was trying to cover up his own actions on this.
The negative possibilities of his,
Huh?
the negative possibilities
Yeah,
of his
right.
information.
Now, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter warned President Roosevelt against allowing Bernays to play a leadership role in World War II, describing him and his colleagues as professional poisoners of the public mind, exploiters of foolishness, fanaticism, and self-interest. Today we might call what Bernays pioneered a particularly brazen set of techniques to manipulate people to get them to do their bidding. So he's kind of like in a way, a modern Machiavellian, I suppose, with his manipulation. Without a moral compass, however, such a transformation promotes a patronizing and ultimately cynical view of human nature and human possibilities. One is likely to destroy lives as to build them up. Propaganda today is widely used by governments. In what ways can such be used to further evil causes? Governments in general. I think we get the American propaganda here, pro-American, anti-Russia, whoever, other people. Maybe we need to have a little bit more objective view as to maybe all governments, or at least important governments, are all guilty of more or less the same thing. There have been several studies which point to people from random populations doing acts which in the least might certainly be considered as antisocial. In these cases, there was an authority figure who in a sense was the instigator. In a study that purported to examine punishment on learning, psychologist Stanley Milgram found that subjects called teachers were willing to give harmful doses of electricity to other volunteers. Learners. In reality, no shocks were actually given, but they were pretending. The results appear to provide evidence that normal, well-adjusted men would be willing to kill a complete stranger simply because they were ordered to do so by an authority. Well, that's the implication, and maybe in some cases that might be true. As the story goes, Dr. Jekyll used a chemical to turn his alter ego, Dr. Hyde, in real life. However, no chemical may be needed. Instead, just the right dose of certain social situations can transform ordinarily good people into evildoers, as was the case with the Iraqi prisoners in Abu Ghraib. Philip Zimbardo was an American psychology professor at Stanford University. He highlighted how this Dr. Hyde transformation occurred among U.S. soldiers at Abu Ghraib by presenting classic psychology research on situational effects on human behavior. That line between good and evil is permeable. Any of us can move across it. Be careful. I argue that we all have the capacity for love and evil. It's a situation that brings it out. So, does that mean that bad leaders can get followers more easily? Maybe so. If anybody wants to know the details here, I can give them the text. I'm skipping some stuff here.
Maybe you can share it to.
Maybe you could put on the internet that whole,
Yeah,
that's,
Well, I don't have a website.
okay.
but if you have it as a document, as an electronic document, it can be shared.
Yeah, I could send it out by email.
Yeah, you could email
I
it,
could do that if you're
And we
interested.
can
Sure,
post it
just give
on
me
the-
email address.
or maybe schedule it for another time to finish it.
So is he going to do it, or is it going to be handled by somebody who's in charge of? I'm seeing 3 conversations go on about it, so that's why I'm asking what is really going to happen.
What's that?
Bill can email a copy to Betsy. Betsy
You have all the email? I mean, people.
Betsy can distribute it,
It's
or,
long, but it'll go by email.
Or to
Sure.
me, I have everybody's.
Or-
email.
Okay.
or email it to Kathy, or both.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Okay.
Kathy
Bill,
can
is there
send
enough
this.
that we should schedule you for another time to finish up?
Well,
Or do you think you've covered the main points?
I think I've covered the main points. Let me
Okay.
cover a few other things here. We go beyond individuals and consider social classes. Can there be a very different structure and class values that some whole social classes or manifest some traits of the dark triad?
Yes.
You may have heard of Chris Hedges. People here heard of Chris Hedges?
Yes, but I'm not sure why.
Harvard Divinity grad school ordained minister, longtime investigative reporter. What he describes as a lower middle class background, he was able to observe the lives and values of ultra rich people because from the age of 10, on scholarship awarded to gifted children, he resided with children from very wealthy families. From this vantage point, Hedges sees the whole society of the ultra-rich as being morally bankrupt. The whole issue of their education is geared toward the ways of how to rule. From his origins of the lower middle class, he saw the great divide, the rich versus anybody else. Well, you hear a lot about the 1%, don't you, nowadays? The notion of privilege was inculcated from an early age, that of having a right to be served. Okay, here's what Hedges said. The super rich are different. This has nothing to do with aptitude or intelligence. If you are poor, you only get one chance. If you're wealthy, you get chance after chance after chance. Their children are raised in a special culture and know little else. They consider human beings disposable. Even friends of the family become disposable. They are utterly callous and live in a self-encased bubble. Of course, this isn't everybody, but in general, this is what he's saying. They have no notion of concern about the consequences of their actions. In the U.S., we've been saturated with a culture of deification of wealth. Now that's dangerous in itself, and we certainly do. We don't grasp how morally bankrupt the super rich are. They are all subservient to an oligarchic corporate elite which owns the mainstream media. It is therefore easy to promote mediocrity. We in the U.S., this is what Hedges is saying, are the most deluded society on the planet.
I believe it.
The answers are awash with lies. The airwaves are awash with lies, covering up the reality of what the super rich are actually doing. Okay. Now, here's well, we're getting, let me wind this thing up here. Other things they're talking about the rich here, but let's wind it up with psychologist Craig Newman. Based on the results of these and many related studies, we have to ask ourselves, why is it that some individuals in the general population have the dark psychopathic life personalities? Is this due to a genetic mutation or a reflection of our violent world? As it turns out, both nature and nurture are involved in the expression of psychopathic propensities. As such, we have the potential to manifest dark psychopathic-like propensities. Yes, we are a social species and depend fundamentally on one another. We have basic human tendencies to be genuine, empathic, and pro-social toward other individuals. However, it is clear that we also have the ability to harden our hearts and manipulate others, as well as act impulsively or be violent and aggressive toward other people. Thus, we all potentially have a dark side to our human character, though only a fraction display elevated levels of psychopathic-like propensities. In my opinion, and I suspect in the minds of most people, it is far better for us all if we find in each day opportunities to be genuine, empathic, and pro-social, and teach our children the value of these propensities as well. But at the same time, as a society, we must recognize and learn to deal with the dark side of our humanity. So now we have visited what might be the sources of evil as regards humankind. Leaders with psychopathic and narcissistic traits, followers of the principles of Niccolo Machiavelli, aristocrats of the social classes, persons of great wealth, and lastly, any of the rest of us who succumb to authority and turn off our basic instincts of empathy and conscience. I mean, like, I work at the VA with veterans, as a volunteer. Veterans did some terrible things in Vietnam. These are people that are just ordinary people. In times of war, situational, terrible things sometimes. Anyway, I'm going to wind this up here. We have not mentioned altruism, which at present would obviate evil. In conclusion, let's regard the famous saying of Lord Acton, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. According to a recent study, this is not always true. There are people who, when given power, use it for the benefit of others, not necessarily for themselves. There's a little light in the end of the tunnel, maybe. Catherine A. DeSille, a professor of management at the University of Toronto, wondered, when you give good people power, are they more able than others to enact a moral authority to do what's right? I don't know how she defines good people, but whatever. In a study published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, DeSelles and her co-authors found that the answer is yes. People's sense of moral identity, the degree which they thought it was important to their sense of self to be caring, compassionate, fair, and generous, and so on, strongly influenced the way they use power. It would appear that those motivated to assume positions of power would be those persons we have identified as being capable of evil, so that they would put us in a bind. Now, if there was some way to screen out the bad guys and only allow the good guys to have power, this might go a long way to improve the human situation. Could we have a constitutional amendment that requires everyone seeking public office to demonstrate a high level of caring or compassion?
Sure, why not?
A constitutional amendment?
Wouldn't pass, because I don't think there are enough.
But it's a lovely idea.
We need a lot of constitution, I think. Anyway.